From the Church Pension Group, this is Choose Well.
Hi, my name is Krishna and this is Choose Well, the podcast that focuses on well-being, from maintaining physical and psychological health to being financially secure. Today we're talking about financial capability and investment fraud. Leading the questions for today's episode is Janet Todd.
Well, thank you, Krishna.
Janet serves as the Director of Curriculum Development for the Church Pension Group. Our guest joining us is Gerri Walsh.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Gerri is the Senior Vice President of Investor Education at the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, also known as FINRA. We now join Gerri and Janet for part 2 of their discussion as they move from talking about financial capability to investor fraud.
I want to kind of switch the conversation to a second area that FINRA works in, and that's the investment fraud awareness and prevention area. Especially now with COVID-19 going on, we've heard a lot of increase in investors' fraud, and in general, it seems to be very pervasive. So what are some of the tactics that are used in these different investment fraud schemes?
Well, we've been doing a lot of research into fraud susceptibility and how fraudsters are able to carry out their crimes. And it all comes down to psychology, really. So, kind of teeing off our earlier discussion about behaviors that you can engage in, there are actually these psychological tactics that cons use when they're trying to separate you from your money. And there are some persuasion tactics that are particularly associated with investment fraud. We've done some research on various types of financial fraud, like romance scams and the like. And there are different factors that influence those. But when it comes to investment fraud, the scammers almost always kind of create this phantom, right? They create this desire in you for something that you want but can't have, like untold riches or the
Ooh,
prospect of wealth, right? And so that's
yeah,
always what gets you salivating, right? You're like, ooh, I'm really interested in
yeah.
this, hey, this sounds good. And then they kind of build credibility, this tactic called source credibility or expertise, where they either pretend to be with a reputable firm or claim to have a certain expertise or credential. I'm the SVP of investor education at FINRA, so of course I have all this great knowledge right
Of
now.
course you do.
Of course. But I could be lying, right?
Ah,
And the fact that I say it doesn't mean it's true. Now, in my case, it is true. But you never know. And that's how people, they think, oh, wow, this person went to fill in the blank of an Ivy League college, or this person has, fill in the most well-known financial credential. They might, but they might not. And you have to look beyond that. Credibility can be faked. The other things that they do, and this is particularly an issue for any kind of identifiable group, is this social consensus tactic where they claim that other savvy investors are in this, and they might claim that, like, some of the well-known leading lights of investing, the Warren Buffetts, the Bill Gates, blah blah blah, that those folks are all invested. Or they might say all the members of this particular religious denomination or this particular ethnic group or this particular profession are engaged in it. That this is a super smart tactic for ministers or a super smart tactic for doctors or lawyers or whatever the professional group is. But the idea, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where your goals, your needs are yours. And what's right for your neighbor might not be right for you. And so even if you share an affinity with a group of people, the fact that others in that group are investing doesn't mean it's right for you. And the fact that someone tells you that others in the group are investing doesn't mean they actually are. They're just trying to get you to invest. There are a couple other tactics that we see. Reciprocity, I do you a favor, you do me a favor. I buy you lunch, you give me your life savings.
Oh,
That's
that's a
one.
good one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of educational seminars are just that. They're educational. They're opportunities to learn, and there's nothing wrong with them. FINRA uses educational opportunities like that. A lot of organizations do, but there can be a line that gets crossed where you have the sense of like, oh, well, I learned all this information. I got this free book. I got this strategy from this company, so I should invest with them. And just be cautious. The worst, though, is the scarcity tactic where the fraudsters will really start to get your emotions high by suggesting that the opportunity is either time limited or resource limited. There's only one more oil well and you have to buy now, or that it's only available to a certain exclusive group. And that can be the devastating one because that's where we all feel this sense of FOMO, right? The fear of missing out if you don't
Right.
act now. Yeah, but I often say that there are really only a couple of once in a lifetime events, and birth and death are pretty much it. So
Yeah, that is so true. And the idea that everybody else is doing it, I'm going to be the only one who doesn't make this grandiose amount of money from this investment, it really preys on your psychology and you want to be part of what everybody else is doing.
it's human nature to feel that way.
Right.
But going back to the discussion we had about social media, and the comment that you made just now about celebrating their gains, that's another human nature element. People celebrate their successes, but they don't equally tout their failures. And so, for any one supposedly hot stock or hot opportunity or wise strategy for anything, including investing, where someone has made money, there are a lot of people who've lost money and just don't talk about it. So, that's another thing. We have to train ourselves not to get caught up in the hype, but to make those decisions when our emotions are at a low, not a low meaning down, but a low level of intensity.
It's so easy to think that someone's Facebook life is fantastic, but they probably are having the same kind of daily problems and concerns that everyone else is. As you said, they're just not going to post that. And if you didn't buy this investment and other people did and it didn't work out, they probably won't tell you that either. So that's a really good point.
One of the other things that we're seeing, particularly during the last, several months of 2020, is, with COVID, market volatility, with financial strain that many Americans are feeling, with unemployment levels being high, and with stay at home and safer at home orders or recommendations coming from states, there is a little bit of a perfect storm for financial fraud because some of the work that we've done in fraud susceptibility has pointed out that social isolation and financial strain are two of the key predictors of susceptibility to financial frauds and investment frauds. And we're kind of in that environment right now. So
Yes.
it's really important for people, to talk with someone who doesn't have a stake in the game if you're thinking about making a financial decision, whether it's a strategy for paying off your debt or an opportunity to invest in some sort of, will win opportunity. Take the time to step back and talk to somebody that you trust who isn't going to gain financially one way or the other. They don't have a stake in your decision, but they might be able to give you some wisdom about making that decision.
That leads me to a thought. I've been reading a lot about elderly grandparents, or your parents, or maybe some friends that they might have fallen victim because they do fall into a lot of this social isolation, even when it isn't a COVID-19 situation. And, as you said, you should talk to someone before you make the decision. But if you don't and you get caught up in this, oftentimes you're too scared or ashamed to admit it. on the back end once you realize that you fell for this scam, or maybe you don't even know you've fallen for that scam yet. So, what are some signs that we can look at in maybe the behaviors of our elderly parents, friends, grandparents to see that if they have been a victim of a scam?
Well, certainly, when you see that somebody has a new friend, whether it's you know, especially with a widow or widower, if they've all of a sudden, have a new boyfriend or new girlfriend in their lives, or caregivers, there are a couple of things that people can do with their financial accounts, including putting a trusted contact on the account. FINRA requires the securities firms that are subject to its jurisdiction, broker dealers, to ask their customers, their retail customers, for a trusted contact. Now, you don't have to provide one, but the firm is required to ask for that. And it really helps you, the consumer, because you can designate somebody that you trust, that if the firm can't get in touch with you, either because you're climbing Mount Kilimanjaro or you're running a marathon with the penguins in Antarctica, right? I mean, it might not be
Yeah.
that you're incapacitated, it might be some other reason. But if they see suspicious activity happening in your account and can't reach you, or are worried that you're part of some sort of, that you've been sort of manipulated by a new boyfriend, new girlfriend, then they have somebody that they can talk to make sure that you're okay. Thinking about, none of us really want to think about aging and reaching points of incapacity, but it is important to think about how we want to manage our assets. Should we hit a period of incapacity, and certainly after we die. And there are resources that we have about sort of, putting together powers of attorney, transfer on death orders that you can do to make sure that your assets are disposed of the way you want them to. But those key signs of fraud are sort of large, unexplained money leaving the account. If an elderly relative suddenly changes their appearance. They're not bathing, they're disheveled, they're not able to speak as much. There may be a health issue that's driving that, but there may also be, a financial component to something untoward going on in their lives. It's really important to investigate.
That's very good advice. So the next time I get on and my account says, "Do you want to add a trusted contact?" I'm not going to click skip now. I think I'll click in yes. Add one in
It's a,
there.
exactly. It's a wise idea.
Well, because the point is well taken. You may not need to be elderly for this to be a problem. You could be incapacitated in many different ways or just unable to have access to your account. So that's a very good point. It works for all of us. Continuing on the idea of fraud schemes, if you think that someone is approaching you or is trying to pull a scheme over on you, what are some things that you can do to help prevent yourself from being drawn into that?
One of the most important things you can do is end the conversation. And that's harder than you think it might be. But, we encourage people to practice saying no. And, some people have a difficult time saying no. But, practice over and over. I'm sorry, I'm not interested. Thank you. Or, I never make my investment decisions without consulting my, and then fill in the blank. It can be, your niece, your accountant, your pastor, whoever it is. You can use me. I mean, go ahead and invent this mythical, sister or counselor or something like that, but get yourself away, like turn the table and ask questions. Especially if somebody's touting something that has, extraordinary benefits, start kind of, being your own devil's advocate and asking, well, okay, you're telling me how this can make me money. How can I lose money? What would it take to make money, and how might that thing not happen? Right? If your ship has to come in for your riches to arrive, what happens if a storm takes down the ship before it ever reaches
Right.
harbor? those kinds of questions. And then, make sure that, ask whether the person is registered to sell investments or to even give investment advice. In the United States, the securities laws do protect investors by requiring that people who sell securities or give investment advice have to be registered either with FINRA, with the Securities and Exchange Commission, or with the state securities regulator. Every state has a securities regulator, and there's an organization called NASA, the North American Securities Administrators Association, that has information on how you can get in touch with your state securities regulator. But find out more about the product. And when you start peppering people with questions, they might be a little bit irritated. They might feel like, hey, I'm the expert. Let me just take care of this for you. But if they're a scammer, they'll probably give up because you're not worth the effort. And then, as we discussed earlier, talk to somebody else. Make sure that you not only end the conversation, but like run the idea by someone who doesn't have a stake in the game. So it's sort of like embrace skepticism. We all like to trust other people, but we really, in order to do right by ourselves and by our financial goals and by our families, it's really important that we exercise caution when it comes to making financial decisions.
Are there any tools available? Because someone can tell me they're licensed, but how could I check up on them?
FINRA offers a free tool that's available 24/7 on our website. It's called Broker Check, and you can get to it by going to finra.org/brokercheck. And you can look up a financial professional and find out whether they are licensed as a registered investment professional, a broker, or an investment advisor. And you can also see the history that they've had, how long they've been in the industry, which firms they've worked at, whether they've worked at a series of firms that have gone out of business might be of interest for you, or firms that have been sanctioned. They may have sanctions themselves. You can gain access to their disciplinary history. The truth is that most of the individuals who are registered as brokers or investment advisors are honest, hardworking people who want to do right by their clients. But there are a couple of people who have had these customer complaints that have wound up in the customer's favor. And if you are going to be trusting your money to someone, you probably want to know whether they have, a history of regulatory run-ins.
I know that you also had a series of videos that we made a course out of them where we put situations and like the scarcity one, you know, if you saw this, what should you do? And in that video, it does have some techniques of how you can turn the conversation on someone. And I think your point about if you're the one that's asking a lot of questions, they're not going to want to deal with you and they'll find a way to back away because they're looking for the easy money, I'm guessing.
That's usually the case. It's too much effort. And, I think that's why you see more phishing scams, email scams, social media scams, those kinds of things, because that sort of, you can really spread your seeds far and wide in terms of trying to get somebody to part with their money. Whereas the one-on-one interaction that's usually necessary for an investment fraud is it's a little more time consuming, and the fraudsters aren't going to waste time on someone who's peppering them with questions.
Gerri, we discussed what seems like two very different topics, financial preparedness and investor fraud. And these two areas really affect what has been very popular in the financial press, this idea of your sense of well being, where finances have a really big part of that. So, can you describe a little bit about what you think of when you hear financial well being and how investor fraud and financial preparedness tie into that?
Financial well-being has it's an emerging term, and it has a variety of definitions. But when I think of financial well-being, it's satisfaction with where you are with what you have. So it's less about knowledge, it's less about income, but it's more about being able to make ends meet, feeling like you can plan ahead, feeling like you're able to achieve financial goals with what you have. And if you've lost money to a financial fraud, you've not only lost those dollars, you've likely had non monetary impacts as well: loss of sleep, inability to trust, anxiety. And many of us in the United States are already pretty anxious. But, to be all the more anxious because you've lost money, feeling this sense that you're not able to recover. And there are also additional impacts. So these non-monetary losses, the actual loss itself of the investment, but it can be costly to be a victim of financial fraud because you often have legal bills, you might have late charges that you incur because money that you thought you were going to have to, achieve a certain milestone or pay off a certain bill is no longer available to you. So there are some serious consequences and a particularly significant hit to one's sense of well-being overall, physically and financially.
Yeah, that's a very interesting tie-in of the two, and I'm glad that we were able to make that because I think that there are so many people out there who do feel this anxiety around their finances. And I think your financial capability study showed that almost about half of the people are very anxious. So adding something like investor fraud on top of that, on top of COVID-19 pandemic, it can be a substantial hit to somebody's overall well-being, not just financial well-being.
Exactly.
So this has been a very, very informative conversation, and I really want to thank you for sharing your experience with us. Your enthusiasm and your care really come out in the way you answered and way you responded, and I just want to thank you for that. And it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you. It's been a joy for me.
So, Krishna, I'm going to hand it back to you for some final closing comments.
Thanks again, Gerri and Janet. I've certainly learned a lot about financial capability and investment fraud, and I'm sure our audience has as well. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Theme music for our podcast is by Fran McKendry. Be sure to visit the e-learning library and learning center on cpg.org for wellness resources. And please join us again for Choose Well.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fees and other terms and restrictions may apply. The information presented here is not investment advice and does not take into account the investment objectives, financial situation, or retirement needs of particular individuals. It is important that you consider this information in the context of your personal risk tolerance, investment objectives, and financial and retirement goals. You should not rely on this information in making any investment or other decision that will affect your personal financial, retirement, or tax situation. You should contact your own professional advisor prior to making any such decision. Neither the Church Pension Fund nor any of its affiliates, collectively CPG, is responsible for the content, performance, or security of any website referenced herein that is outside the www.cpg.org domain or that is not otherwise associated with a CPG entity. You've been listening to Choose Well from the Church Pension Group.